Well, welcome to the presentation on Daniel chapter 5. We've knocked out 4 chapters so far. Last time, the fiery furnace experience. This week, the week before that was fiery furnace. We
Yeah.
learned about the humbling of the king last week. This week, we're going to touch on a term that many of you might have heard growing up. We don't hear a lot about it anymore, but things like, I went to the mall today and the handwriting was on the wall. And it kind of implies a foreboding, some bad judgment is going to take effect. So that handwriting on the wall phrase, we're going to learn the origin of that today in today's study. A brief summary of Daniel chapter 5. We are introduced to a new king, Belshazzar. He takes the place of Nebuchadnezzar. And among his noteworthy activities that Daniel captures in this book is holding a dinner where he's celebrating just about the time that the city is falling under siege. And he's celebrating, and he actually drags out uh, golden goblets and other uh, instruments that were stolen years before by his father Nebuchadnezzar and used in rituals within the Jewish temple. So he is using them for a profane purpose. He's uh, doing things with them that God never intended. And during this drunken party, a mysterious hand, fingers, if you will, writes a message on the wall, and it's known to be a message of judgment, but he doesn't understand it. So once again, the king, as they often do, call on his wise men to interpret the writing. And lo and behold, the queen mother says, hey, there was this guy. He's in his 80s now. So Daniel is much older in this chapter than we remember reading about him in prior chapters. But he is the one who can interpret. And he comes and he gives the interpretation and explains that it's actually a verdict that is against Belshazzar. And that judgment is the end of his reign and kingdom. And that very night, Babylon falls. So that's what we have to read as far as an overview. Breaking it down a little bit, I mentioned a new king. We had Nebuchadnezzar. Following him is this Belshazzar that we're going to read about tonight. And quite a bit of time has elapsed. Daniel went from a young boy in Nebuchadnezzar's court to an old man now in Belshazzar's court. There's another character we'll read about in the chapters 5 and 6 named Darius the Mede. And we're not sure if that's actually a literary designation or a real title, but there's also Cyrus the Great. We're going to learn about him and read about him as that next king in line. Where this comes from is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. If you remember, he dreamt about a head of gold, and it was interpreted by Daniel that he was that head. He was a singular leader, very strong, very valuable, very important. But after him would come two arms. And these arms, this chest and arms, was not as good. It was silver, it wasn't as good as gold. And in fact, it was inferior, but it held a wider area, just like the head and shoulders is kind of wider than the head. So the rule is going to be broader, but it's not going to be as powerful as that singular leader. So what happens after that Babylonian rule is going to change into this Medo-Persian rule that we're going to read about when we get to chapter 20. There's a symbology used there of a two-horned ram that represents this Media and Persia. We're going to read about those as well. So that explains uh, the 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 dream and the statue and Nebuchadnezzar's transition. This profane feast that takes place in verses 1 through 4. There's this impending attack on the city, but almost to fiddle while Rome burns, same kind of analogy. He throws a party and he invites all the heads of state, all the important friends, and in fact says, not only did we defeat those Jews, some 70, 80 years ago, we're going to defeat whoever tries to attack our city because it's so well designed, so well defended. So they take these sacred vessels and they bring them out from storage and they start using them for their own revelry. And it really shows the moral decay at the height of this imperial power. And there's symbology there that applies to us today that we have to be aware of is that, we might have past successes that we want to rest on, and we forget that all good and all source of power comes from God and is for God's power. This writing on the wall that we read about in verses 5 through 9, human hand appears, it completely terrorizes the king and his officials. They turn to their normal soothsayers, their wise men, and they're unable to interpret the message. This is a recurring theme in Daniel's writing. Once again, the um, uh, profane power, the secular powers are not a match for God's power. And it exposes that emptiness of their pagan wisdom that's going to result in a defined judgment. The queen remembers this guy Daniel and says, "Hey, it's her son. You should summon him. He'll be able to interpret this dream." And this older man, young man compared to many of us in his mere 80s, is summoned and shows his insight and understanding. And it shows this real contrast between being faithful and the secular beliefs. It shows how truth is ignored until a real crisis focuses attention. We can get all wrapped up in watching sports and watching movies and kind of not paying attention to what's really important around us. So Daniel rebukes Belshazzar. Belshazzar attempts to bribe Daniel and kind of says, "Hey, I can make you an important man again. I can give you wealth. I can make you the number 3 guy in the country." And it helps to explain then that he's really probably number 2 in the country as far as leading. And unfortunately, Daniel interprets this message and it uses a famous phrase about being weighed and found wanting. That actually writing on the wall, the specific 25 to 28, is this mene tekel parson. And the definition is explained by Daniel. It's not known what language this is in. There's some who speculate, oh, it was probably written in Hebrew and they just didn't understand Hebrew. That's probably not a good explanation because these were learned men. There'd be at least somebody who knew Hebrew. It was something more, that required God's help to interpret. And it says, that you have been numbered, you have been weighed, and you've been either divided or you've been found short. You've been found wanting. And in fact, that phrase was very popular. It was actually included in this movie if you saw it in The Knight's Tale. So even in popular literature, we've seen that phrase come down. In verses 29 to 31, he again offers to give him the third seed, a gold chain, but the king is killed that very night. And that begins the Medo-Persian rule. How they got in, and this was information that was verified outside of the scriptures, is that 2 writings, one called Herodotus and one called Xenophon in the 4th and 5th century BC, talked about how the city was won without a battle. And the idea that they diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, that allowed the water level to drop far enough that the invaders were able to walk underneath of the bars that had been placed below bridges to keep people from swimming down under the gate. The water had gone far enough down they could just walk right under them. And then the main inner doors, the brass inner doors, were left open. And you think, oh my gosh, how could you be so foolish? Well, here, 150 years before this, in Isaiah, one of the studies we completed a couple of studies ago, in verses 45, it says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus." Again, this is 150 years before Cyrus even existed, "to open the doors before him so that the gates will not be shut." So this implication that Isaiah as a prophet, foresaw this rise of Cyrus, this rise of the Persians that would overthrow the Babylonians after they had done God's work, which was to punish the Jews for that 75-year period. And for many, many years, there was no data to support the existence of this Belshazzar until in the 1850s, a cylinder was found. And the cylinder of Nabonidus documented the existence of the person, Nabonidus, who was actually a ruler just before Belshazzar. And it also documented the fact that the city at that time had fallen without battle. So, archaeological support for the story in Daniel that we didn't have until the late 1800s. That's all we have for tonight. I hope you enjoy the study.